The Pirates of New England is this talk tonight. So if you're here for the Pirates of Pittsburgh, you're in the wrong place, wrong state, and wrong season. So Seth Goldstein is our speaker tonight, and very exciting to have Seth here. Seth grew up on Cape Cod, where he developed his passion for maritime history, and his research interests include historic Northern Atlantic fishery, global piracy, New England shipwrecks and lighthouses, and the whaling industry, and Maine's connection to Atlantic world African enslavement. Seth is affiliated with the Atlantic Black Box Project, a grassroots nonprofit dedicated to uncovering and sharing New England's marginalized history. He has taught in several community universities and colleges around here. He is currently the director of Cushing's Point Museum at Buglight and director of development at the South Portland Historical Society. So we have a close connection with him, and he has close connection with Cape Elizabeth as well. So Seth, it's all yours.
All right, thanks so much, Bob. Appreciate it. Hi, everybody. What a lovely turnout here in Cape Elizabeth. Thanks for coming out tonight. On such a chilly night, I wasn't sure what kind of crowd we'd get. But thank you for braving the weather, and I will endeavor to make it worth your while. You know, I fell in love with maritime history and New England's maritime history growing up on Cape Cod, as Bob said, and my pop was the high school librarian at Harwich High School on Cape Cod for many, many years. In fact, that was his main job. It was back when people just worked one job for their, most of their lives. And so my dad would bring home books about local Cape Cod shipwrecks for me. And, I was 6 or 7 years old. And the joke here is I must have been a weird kid because I was fascinated, at such a young age by this history. And there was something, about the grotesqueness of some of these shipwrecks that just transfixed me. And I still remember one of these shipwrecks, reading about it as a kid, where, what would happen is if a storm came up and boats were going around Cape Cod before the canal was built, all the captains of these historic wooden sailing vessels could do, if the wind was blowing this way, is throw out the anchors and pray. And very often, unfortunately, those prayers were not enough. And I still remember to this day reading about this one wreck where the sailors in the winter climbed into the rigging to escape the icy cold sea spray. Well, that's where they were found the next day by their rescuers, entombed in ice, frozen to death, still clinging to the rigging. And I thought that was fascinating. Right? Must have been a weird kid, right? So another thing that happened when I was growing up on Cape Cod that was very formative in my life was the discovery of the pirate shipwreck Witta, which I'll talk about tonight. It was discovered in 1984 by Barry Clifford, and it was the world's first ever authenticated pirate shipwreck ever discovered. I remember growing up too, some of my friends who lived further up the Cape where the shipwreck was discovered, there were always these rumors, sometimes, it's, oh yeah, Uncle blah, blah, blah was walking on the beach in Wellfleet, he found a piece of 8, so this wreck for a long time lived somewhere between legend and historical fact. And then in 1984, Barry Clifford, who's not an archaeologist, he was a salvager, discovered the wreck. 400,000 artifacts is the number of artifacts that Barry Clifford has pulled off the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. And I'll tell you more about that as part of my presentation today. But so let's see, in 1984, I would have been in the 4th grade. So once again, very formative event in my life. So as Bob said, one of the things that I study is global piracy. And I had the pleasure for a few years of teaching students at the Maine College of Art and Design. I built a class for them about global piracy. And well, guess what? Turns out 20-year-old art school students think pirates are really cool, right? As do most people. And so that was a great class. We had a lot of fun together talking about, hi, Emma. Come on in. Emma's from Cape Cod, too. She grew up with me. Yeah. And so Just to say that these were very formative events in my life, and the pirate ship Witta has a special place in my heart, as does piracy in general. So let's get into it. Pirates of New England. So this is Cotton Mather, who we all know from colonial history. One of the things that he loved to rail against was piracy in the early colonial period. And so, if these pirates were captured and they were in jail, which they always spell with a G in the olden days, goal, right? He would go and he would try to get them to convert to Christianity before they swung by the neck. And sometimes he did, and sometimes he didn't. And some of these guys were cared about the condition of their souls in the afterlife, and some of them not so much. And then, sometimes what they would do is they would hang somebody and they would put them in what's known as the gibbets, which was a metal cage they would put your body in so that as your body deteriorated and biodegraded, it would hold your skull and your bones in a cage, and they would put these, on islands or river mouths as a warning to other people about piracy. But Cotton Mather was always concerned about his community, and so he always was trying to remind, especially the sailors of Boston, not to fall prey to piracy. And so he said, "And a supplication for our seafaring people, that they may more generally turn and live unto God, that they may not fall into the hands of pirates, that such as are fallen into their hands may not fall into their ways, that the poor captives may, with cries to God that shall pierce the heavens, procure his good providence to work their deliverance, and that the pirates now infesting the seas may have a remarkable blast from heaven following them," is what Cotton Mather said. So we're taking a look here. You can see, when we think about piracy, we're really just, most of us, thinking about this golden age of piracy that I have detailed here. But of course, piracy is like the world's second oldest profession, maybe. Basically, there was a guy with a log floating around, and then another guy with a log tried to take his log, right? It was a very old tradition, and it's global. In fact, the most powerful pirate in world history was a woman from China in the 1800s, said to have 17,000 pirates who served underneath her. But the piracy that we're all most familiar with, at least here in the United States, and darn you, Johnny Depp, for Pirates of the Caribbean, is this golden age of piracy here, which starts with the buccaneers. And that was the period 1650 to 1680. And this is fascinating. They get their name from a French word, it's a boucan, which is a type of grill using green wood that they would cure meat over. These buccaneers became buccaneers because they used the boucan. And this, my friends, is where barbecue comes from. And in fact, this was an indigenous American Caribbean way of preserving food that these buccaneers, many of them French and English, adapted, and they were living on islands such as Puerto Rico and Hispaniola, and they were capturing these feral cows and pigs and curing the meat on these boucans, these green wooden grills, so that they could sell that meat to passing ships. And so they become the buccaneers. Captain Morgan is perhaps the most famous of these buccaneers. These are, as I said, primarily English and French, and they attack primarily the shipping of Spain. And then a little bit later, you get your pirates who move into the Indian Ocean. In fact, they have a base on the island of Madagascar, on a small island out of Madagascar called St. Mary's Island. And William Kidd exemplifies this period of piracy. And then finally, the period of piracy that we're all the most familiar with, 1716 to 1726, when you get all your real famous pirates like Blackbeard or Calico Jack Rackham, or the two famous female pirates, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, are all from this period. Charles Vane, some of the other pirates that we're familiar with. Oh, by the way, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them, but if you would save them till the end of the lecture, that'd be great. So, pirate crews are formed in one of two ways. First of all, mutiny aboard a merchant vessel, or if you have a lot of guys on a small boat, it gets a little unwieldy after a while. And so sometimes the crews would split up if they captured a boat. Some guys would stay on the boat. Some guys would take over the new boat. When a crew formed, the first thing they did was to draft the ship's articles. These were the rules under which they all agreed to live. So this is really interesting. So this is like, what do we call this? This is like democracy, right? This is an early form of democracy. They would all agree to live under certain conditions. And the neat thing about pirates was they elected their officers. So the captain, if he wasn't doing a good job, could be voted out. And sometimes the pirate captains were really, if they were like abusing their crew, they could even be put to death by their crews. The pirates' captains only had power when they were chasing or being chased or during battle. Other than that, they got no special considerations. They didn't get a cabin or a special bed or any special food, and they served at the pleasure of the crew. Right? Once again, an elected officer. Another elected officer that was very important was the quartermaster. Was another elected position, and he was the guy who was kind of in charge of the interests of the crew. He would be the guy who went over to a captured vessel and ascertained what the treasure was. He would split the treasure up. He would dole the treasure out, and he would kind of keep tabs on the captain, make sure the captain didn't have too much power. So you had pirate crews, they would get together, they would come up with the articles, and they would elect their officers. Sometimes the articles would stipulate things such as how long the crew would stay together. We're not going to break up the band until we capture, blah, blah, blah pieces of 8. We're going to get this much money before we consider breaking up the crew. They use shares, which is a way of dividing up the prize. This is an ancient system that goes back to, fishermen in prehistoric times, in which you would make a certain amount or a share of the profits from a given voyage. So it incentivizes people to do work. So the interesting thing about the shares for pirates is that the captain didn't get much more than a common sailor. So perhaps the captain would get between a share and a half and 2 shares. The quartermaster gets a share and a half. Maybe specialists like the carpenter also gets a share and a half. And then the regular pirates just got a share. So very equitable as far as what would happen with the money. This is interesting. A form of early social security in which injured pirates would be taken care of. Hence, the articles would stipulate, for example, you get so many pieces of 8 if you lost your right arm. It'd be like, say, 800 pieces of 8 for the right arm. Interestingly, your left arm was worth slightly less. 700 pieces of 8 for your left arm. Same with the leg. Right leg worth slightly more than the left leg. And if you were left-handed, unfortunate for you, apparently. Some pirates didn't allow gambling or drinking on board in an effort to curb fighting. Conflicts between 2 individuals to be settled on land, not on the ship, in an effort to keep peace on board the ship. If you had a conflict with somebody, you waited till you got to land, and then it was pistols and swords. So each guy would take a shot, and if they both missed, to swords. And this was not a fight to the death. This was just a fight to first blood. And that's how they would resolve conflicts. But always on shore in an effort to keep the conflicts from spilling out on board the ship. And once again, all major decisions to be made by vote by the whole company of the crew. So, think about, once again, it's very egalitarian. A lot of these sailors are coming from either naval vessels or merchant vessels. And so they had very little power on board, and sometimes the captains would be sadistic. They would beat their crew members, they would whip their crew members for the minorest of infractions. So all of a sudden, when these guys become pirates, it's a big deal for them to wield some of this power. Another thing that it stipulates in the articles that I don't have here is that they would have access to food. I was just telling my wife and kids this before I came over here. What they called belly timber. And there was a phrase, There was no belly, no fighting before belly timber, something like that, right? Belly timber just means food. Now, what that meant was they were allowed to eat whatever they wanted. And they were allowed to drink whatever they wanted in whatever quantity they wanted. This doesn't seem like a big deal, but recall once again that a lot of these guys are coming from the Navy or from merchant boats, where not only is their food awful, but they get very small quantities of it. Probably not enough to feed them, to provide the calories they would need for the very labor-intensive work they were doing. So for them to be able to eat what they wanted, to drink what they wanted, to sleep where they wanted, and to have agency over their activities for this time was a really big deal. So in the early colonial period, Wabanaki freedom fighters were labeled as pirates here in what is today the state of Maine. At the time, it was the province of Maine. And I have a quote here. This is from an article in CEHPS magazine from 2022. And if you're a maritime history nerd like I am, of course you have a subscription to the quarterly publication CEHPS magazine. Wait, you don't? What? This is a great article, though, so go back and read it. A term of convenience. The word piracy was already loaded with economic and political implications from beyond the New England coast, notoriously and overwhelmingly influencing trade and travel. Pirates dominated the period between 1650 and 1750, now referred to as the Golden Age of piracy. The geographic and cultural shifts of this term into Anglo-Wabanaki contexts coincides with the broader British effort to delegitimize indigenous resistance to colonial expansion. Well, it's kind of fancy sounding. What does that mean? If you want to delegitimize somebody, you call them a pirate. Did the Wabanaki think of themselves as pirates? No, of course not. This was during the French and Indian Wars. They thought of themselves as freedom fighters, right? But what happened was, as many of you know, the Wabanaki people were excellent sailors, and they had an intimate relation with the ocean. In fact, the Mi'kmaq of the Canadian Maritimes in northern Maine, listen to this, 90% of their caloric intake was from the sea. 90% of what they ate, they got from the sea, whether it was fishing or seaweed or shellfish or lobsters, which are also shellfish. So you can see how important the sea is to them. And so many of you probably know, too, that they were very adept sailors, and they built these very large canoes that were ocean-going canoes. And in the early historical record of European colonizers and explorers here, they discuss Wabanaki people even harpooning whales, right? Which is, once again, when we think about indigenous people, maybe not necessarily what we think of, but here in Maine, it was such a big part of their lives. And so what they're saying here is that the Wabanaki people would take European vessels, usually small boats like shallops or pinnaces, that they would steal or they would buy from the French, and they would use them against the English. And they would use them so effectively against the English that they would defeat the English with their own ships. And so the English, they're a little embarrassed, right? They just got their butts kicked by the indigenous people using their own vessels. They called them pirates as a way to say, well, you know what? They beat us, but the only reason they did was because there was something underhanded about the way they did it. They're pirates, right? And that's how you delegitimize a freedom fighter. And when I was teaching the class at the Maine College of Art and Design about global piracy, the students and I found this again and again. You can use this term piracy to delegitimize people who are fighting for different causes. So I have a quote here, once again, from the article. After Indians seized, quote, a large schooner with 2 swivel guns. Swivel gun is a gun that goes on the rail of a deck as opposed to a gun that goes on a carriage. From the Isle of Shoals during Doomer's War in the 1720s, a modest sloop and shallop crewed by Maine and Ipswich men was commissioned to sail in pursuit. Not long after the departure, the dejected crew returned, quote, with their rigging much damaged by the swivel guns. and were able to give no other account of the enemy that they had gone into Penobscot. So what had happened was the indigenous people used a shallop against these English guys and defeated them. Once again, stunned residents of York, Maine witnessed, quote, a fishing captain after the natives fired a great gun at him during King William's War in 1692, remarking also that they sail incomparably well, that the Wabanaki people sailed incomparably well, meaning they sailed as well as the English sailed these vessels, if not better, incomparably well. Now, the first European pirate here in Maine waters is this guy known as Dixie Bull, which I think we can all agree is a very cool name. Dixie Bull arrives on the Maine coast in the early 1630s, so as you can see, very early in the colonial period, he conducts a brisk trade for beaver pelts with the Wabanaki, and at this time, in the early colonial period, beaver's the thing, right? Before masts, before salt cod, before lumber, the reason why Europeans are really interested in Maine is these beaver pelts, because at the time, everybody's wearing beaver pelt hats and coats in Paris, right? It's the height of fashion. So beaver pelts is where people are at in the 1630s. He's attacked by a group of French privateers. Well, hey, you might ask, hey, Seth, what's the difference between a privateer and a pirate? And that's a great question. A privateer is somebody who is sanctioned to attack the shipping of one nation, maybe a couple of nations. So they would get what was known as a letter of marque from a government, right? So if you're English and England is at war with France, the British government gives you a letter of marque to attack French shipping. And that's only good as long as England's at war with France. Once the peace treaty comes, you know, that's it. Letter's over. It doesn't count anymore. Pirates attack anyone of any nation. So there's a difference. Privateers are legally sanctioned by a government to pursue an enemy. Pirates just attack whoever they want. So these are French privateers. According to the book Pirates of New England, or Pirates of the New England Coast, the French took Bull's shallop, once again, a small one-masted sailing vessel, and trade goods consisting of, quote, coats, rugs, blankets, biscuits, etc. So a furious Bull gathers a small force of guys to go with him and goes off in pursuit of the French, who had taken his trade goods, but he's unable to find them, and wanting to replace his lost trade goods, he resorts to capturing 2 English vessels. Well, now Dixie Bull's a pirate, right? He's captured British shipping of his own nation. He then sets his sight on Fort Pemaquid at the mouth of Pemaquid River, northeast of modern-day Booth Bay Harbor. The fort at the time, 1630s, a robust trade center, home to roughly 500 English traders and fishermen by the year 1632. So once again, very early in the colonial period. So Bull and his men managed to steal food and goods to the value of 500 British pounds at the time. And you know, that would probably be, in terms of today's money, somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000. On their way out of the harbor after stealing these goods, a well-placed shot from the fort kills one of Dixie Bull's men on the boat. And this really seems to have scared Dixie Bull and his other fellow pirates. Now, they launch an expedition out of modern-day Portsmouth, New Hampshire. At the time, it was called Piscataqua Plantation. They send out 4 armed vessels in pursuit of Bull, but they can find no trace of them. This expedition is considered to be the first formal naval expedition in northern New England history. So, though occasional sightings and encounters over the next few months, it becomes clear to colonial authorities that Bull and his men, fearful of being hanged, have repented. They pay for goods at English plantations. They give up excessive drinking, perish the thought, and send letters to all the governors of English colonies ascertaining their desire to conduct no further attacks on their English brethren. Now, Dixie Bull's never captured, and he's one of these figures who just kind of disappears from history. Some folks say that he was captured by indigenous people and put to death. Some people say He wound up in a French settlement. We just don't know. He disappears from history. But Dixie Bull is considered to be the first European pirate here in Maine waters. This is Edward Lowe. Edward Lowe, I think we would consider him in today's terms to be a sociopath. Yeah, he was, and some of these guys were, right? And some of them were very civil, and some of them would torture people just for the fun of it. And this was Edward Lowe, and he's the gentleman in the bottom here. And they would capture some of these pirates, fishermen, off the Canadian Maritimes. And many of you know that the Canadian Maritimes was the richest fishery in the world, going back to like even before Columbus. You had the Basque people who were fishing off the Canadian Maritimes, and probably some of you have read the excellent book, Cod, a biography of the fish that changed the world, because the codfish was so important to world history. So there were these fishermen, many of them from Massachusetts, who were fishing off the Canadian Maritimes. And the pirates, as you can see on this map here, they had what they called a round. And so seasonal route that they would take. And so, they would be in the Caribbean up until hurricane season. And then fearing hurricanes, they would go up to the Canadian Maritimes and they would capture the fishermen. And they would harass them, and they would steal their fish and whatever good stuff they had on board the boats. So Philip Ashton is one of these fishermen. He's from Marblehead, Massachusetts. He's captured by this guy, Edward Lowe, who, once again, not a very nice guy, known for his extreme cruelty. He becomes what's known as a forced man. A forced man. That means that he's compelled to join the pirates. And the reason why the pirates would do this is sometimes they would need more crew, and they were always looking for, in particular, specialists, surgeons, carpenters, sailmakers, blacksmiths. And if they found one of these individuals, they would be forced to join. And they would try to get them to sign the articles. And very often, these forced men would resist signing the articles because they knew that if they signed the articles, that made it official. They were part of the pirate crew. If they were ever captured and they didn't sign the articles, they could always testify about that, and perhaps they would be found innocent. If not, they would be put to death. So in this case, Philip Ashton never signs the articles under Edward Lowe. And Edward Lowe, does all this stuff to try to, puts a gun to his head, threatens to kill him on multiple occasions. He stays strong, and he is never signs the articles. Eventually, he runs away when the pirates are off the coast of Honduras. And he is on a deserted island for many months until he's finally rescued, makes his way back to Massachusetts, and writes a book about the whole event. And so, as I said, the pirate round also eventually includes the island of Madagascar, as you can see here. And there's an island off of Madagascar called St. Mary's Island, where they have a community. And they also have a pirate community in the Caribbean on New Providence Island, which will later become a British colonial possession. And so they have these pirate homes, communities, where sometimes the pirates will settle, they'll marry local women. And one of the things that happens with Madagascar is that it's supplied by merchants from New England, primarily from Newport, Rhode Island. So you have these merchants in Newport, Rhode Island, who are buying the goods that the pirates are capturing, a lot of these off of treasure fleets from the Indian Ocean, or you had fleets that were going to Mecca that were carrying pilgrims with all this treasure, and sometimes the pirates would capture that stuff, and it didn't do them any good to just hold on to it, and so they would ship that stuff to New England, where the New England merchants were happy to buy those materials, especially because they were paying so much to the British government for British goods. Right? And in return, they would ship to places like Madagascar all sorts of things that the pirates who were living there wanted. A lot of rum, furniture, candles, soap, all sorts of stuff. And so this was, once again, part of the pirate round. So once again, you had some of these pirates who were not very nice, and they would employ torture to force captives to reveal any hidden loot that they may have hidden on their person. This guy, Edward Lowe, let's see, he found out that there was this captain of a merchant ship, And he knew he was being pursued by pirates, so he took a bag of money and he tied it to a rope outside of his cabin window. And when the boat was captured, he cut the rope, thereby, the gold going into the ocean. So Lowe finds out that he did this. So what's he do? He cuts off his lips, he roasts his lips, and then he makes him eat his own lips. Yeah. When I did this lecture in front of my kids, I had to cover up their ears. This happens sometimes. So Pirate Edward Lowe, once again, known for his cruelty, slicing off parts of bodies of his captives, making them eat those body parts. In the picture here, you see a pirate pastime. This was known as the sweat. And what they would do is they would strip an individual down and make him run around the mast below decks while poking them with sharp implements to the music of a fiddle. And this was just something that they did for entertainment because, once again, they were not particularly nice. So here you see Fort Loyal, which was at the foot of India Street. In fact, there's a plaque today on the last remaining building of the Grand Trunk Railroad, which is a bank today, but it's on the corner of India and Commercial. And it says, oh, this is where Fort Loyal was. But it wasn't really, because that area was underwater until the 1850s. So Fort Loyal really sat at the corner of India and 4th Street, because 4th Street used to be right along the water, and that's why it's called 4th Street, because it used to go right along what was known as the Fore River. Funny side story, I had to buy a suit last week because I'm going out to California for my wife's cousin's son's wedding, right? And I needed a new suit. So I went to Joseph's, which is on 4th Street, and I was in the changing room. By the way, if you need a suit, Joe will hook you up. Right? Really nice guy. I just happened to get Joe from Joseph's. Anyway, so I'm in the changing room, and I look down, and I can see these stones on the wall. And what I realized was that was the seawall on the back of the building, because the water used to be right up against that building. So I thought that was really cool. I told Joe. He said, oh, you know your stuff, right? Anyway, so Fort Loyal was a fort that was built to protect English colonizers from the French and their Wabanaki allies. And this was built between King Philip's War and King William's War, so about 1688. And so Fort Loyal was there on the Portland waterfront. And so in 1689, this guy, Thomas Pound, had been part of the British Navy. He departs Boston Harbor with a small crew, and what he's determined to do is he wants to sail down to the West Indies to attack French shipping. But he thinks, I'm going to need a bigger boat, right? And he needs maybe some more men and some gunpowder. So he comes up here to Casco Bay. And he comes into Casco Bay, steals a calf and 3 sheep from one of the islands where they had, pastured the animals, and that's why you have a Ram Island. Point of interest, Great Diamond Island used to be called Hog Island, right? And then, a bunch of rich people bought summer homes there. They didn't want to live on Hog Island, so it became Little Diamond Island. But the reason why it's Hog Island is because, guess what? It's a lot cheaper to put your hogs on an island than it is to build a bunch of fences. And so that's why you have Ram Island and Goat Island and Hog Island. So they take some of these animals they find on the island as food, and then they sail into the harbor and they anchor close to Fort Loyal at the foot of modern-day India Street. And they send some guys ashore, 3 guys. And one of the guys knows Sylvanus Davis, who is the guy in charge of Fort Loyal at the time. And they make up a story like, hey, we were attacked by pirates off of Cape Sable while we were fishing. They took all our food, and the captain's injured, and we need a doctor. Can we borrow your doctor? So the doctor goes on board. And he comes back, and he seems very nervous, right? Captain Sylvanus Davis can't figure it out. What had happened was they wanted this surgeon to join them on their trip to the West Indies. As I had told you, they were always looking for specialists like doctors and carpenters. Surgeon, he decides not to go, but for whatever reason, he doesn't tell Captain Sylvanus Davis about this. But Davis is a little wary. He tells his men to be on guard that night. Well, in the middle of the night, 7 of his soldiers take all of the arms from the other soldiers, all of the gunpowder, a brass cannon, and the fort's 1 boat, and they abscond, and they go out to Pound's boat, and they depart Casco Bay. And so Captain Sylvanus Davis wakes up in the morning. Some of his soldiers are gone. He loses his one brass cannon. Now, interestingly, in 1690, during King William's War, the Fort Loyal is besieged by French and their Wabanaki allies. And after several days of being besieged, the English surrender. They ask for terms from the French, who say, I think they want to march to, Portsmouth. The French say, sure, no problem. But when these English settlers, about 200 of them, soldiers, men, women, and children, come out of the fort, they're massacred by the Wabanaki, who, the historical record reflects that they just leave the bodies laying there, sun-bleached bones laying in the sun several years later, because no English colonizers returned to this area for several years after that, and the Wabanaki are able to reassert their claim over this territory. And some historians hypothesize that if Sylvanus Davis had these additional men, and certainly the brass cannon that had been taken, perhaps they would have been able to better defend Fort Loyal. But, we can talk about Wabanaki resistance. You'll have to have me back sometime, and I can tell you some more about that. So anyways, this guy Pound, they sail down to Cape Cod, and they're continuing to take ships around Cape Cod over the next few weeks. And so Massachusetts Governor Simon Bradstreet sends out a boat with 20 soldiers under the command of Captain Samuel Pease to capture the pirates, and they catch up to Pound off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. And this ferocious battle ensues, and they're firing at each other, and Pease says to the pirate Thomas Pound, he says, you should strike your flag. Strike your flag means lower your flag, surrender. And Pound says, come aboard, you dogs, and I will strike you presently, is what Pound says. So after an hour of fighting, the soldiers board the pirate vessel. They fire a volley of shots into the pirates. Then they beat them with the butts of their guns, and they're able to defeat the pirates, killing 4 of them, the rest taken back to Boston for trial. So this guy Pound, he's tried, and then he's convicted, but they don't carry him out to the letter of the law. He's not hanged, and he's sent back to England, where his sentence is done away with, and he becomes a member of the Royal Navy and retires a gentleman, dying several years later. So he must have had some rich and powerful friends to have gotten away with that. But that is some very hyper-local pirate history for you in Casco Bay. So this gets me to the Witta Galley. And here you can see the Witta here. Once again, this is the first ever authenticated pirate shipwreck ever discovered. The Witta Galley, and this is a quote here that I have from Real Pirates, The Untold Story of the Witta, From Slave Ship to Pirate Ship, by Barry Clifford and his historian Ken Kinkor, who passed away several years ago, sadly. They said, quote, the Witta Galley was named for the slave port of Ouida, which is in modern-day Benin, the port of Ouida. The Witta Galley, named after Ouida in modern-day Benin, built in London in 1715 as a slave ship. She left on her maiden voyage in early 1716. 300-ton galley could be rowed or sailed. She represented the best, the most advanced nautical technology of her day. She was a shallow draft vessel, which means that she could sail into shallow water. She had a low silhouette, means that she couldn't be spotted very easily out to sea, and easy to maneuver, and unusually fast, capable of speeds of up to 13 knots. Like all slave ships, the Ouida carried an arsenal of weaponry, which included 18 mounted cannon for defense against attacks by Africans, European warships, or pirates. On her maiden voyage, the Ouida set sail from London out to the English Channel into the Atlantic, then turned south toward the African coast. Slave ships like the Ouida worked their way south and east around the West African coast from modern Gambia and Senegal to Nigeria and Gabon, filling their holds with slaves until they had a full load of human cargo. And so the Ouida then sailed across the Atlantic and dropped off its cargo of enslaved Africans in Jamaica, and then was sailing between the Strait of Florida, so between Cuba and Florida, filled with all of the money that they had made from selling these enslaved Africans in Jamaica. So just packed with treasure when she is spotted by Black Sam Bellamy. Black Sam Bellamy, known as the Prince Pirate. And the story about Black Sam Bellamy is he was one of these many pirates who found himself unemployed after the War of Spanish Succession, which I believe ends in 1713. And so all of a sudden, after the War of Spanish Succession, you have tens of thousands of sailors who are Navy guys. They're used to sailing and fighting. Well, the British Navy, says, hey, thanks for your service. You're out of work, right? These guys, they don't have any other skills. They don't know what else to do. And many of them, like Black Sam Bellamy, turned pirate. But the legend that I got growing up was that there was Black Sam Bellamy was at a tavern in Eastham, Cape Cod. And he saw this beautiful girl, maybe 15 years old. Her name was Maria Hallett, also known as Goody Hallett. And they fell in love. And her hair was flaxen golden like the wheat. Her eyes were as blue as the kettle ponds in Wellfleet, right? And they had this romantic affair. But Black Sam Bellamy knew that her well-to-do parents would never accept him as a partner because he was just this poor sailor. So he goes off to make his fortune as a pirate. And he goes down to the Caribbean, and he's one of the most successful pirates in world history. In 1 year, he captures over 50 ships. And he captures the Witta towards the end of this period, and he packs the Witta with all of this booty from these 50 captured vessels. So, talk a little bit about his crew. Pirate crews were incredibly ethnically diverse. You can see here, multi-ethnic crew of the pirate ship Witta. This is Hendrik Quintar here. He is of African Dutch heritage, free black guy. On the far right, we see John Julian Mosquito, Native American from Central America. And let's see, here you have, and John King, who is the youngest pirate in world history. He was 8 years old. And the story with John King was they captured this boat, and they took him a couple weeks to get the cargo off of it. And the whole time, the kid's saying, I want to be a pirate. Take me as a pirate. And they're like, whatever, kid, right? And then, the day finally comes. They've got all the booty. And he's like, take me as a pirate. I'm gonna kill myself if you don't take me. And his mom's like, settle down. He's like, Mom, I'm going to kill you if they don't take me. And the pirates, for whatever reason, they decide to take this 8 or 9-year-old boy with them. And he's the youngest pirate in world history. And we know that this is a fact. And I'll show you why in just a little bit. But we have the youngest pirate in world history. But once again, incredibly diverse. Marcus Rediker wrote a great book about piracy. This is in the 1990s called Villains of All Nations. And he calls them a motley crew. Not like the hair band from the 1980s, right? But because they were so ethnically diverse. You had people from a variety of European countries, free Africans, formerly enslaved Africans, and indigenous Americans from both North and South America serving on board these vessels. And so here you can see, this is from an essay called Black Men Under the Black Flag. This here is what's known as a maroon. And I remember when I was an undergraduate, the professor said, does anybody know what a maroon is? And I raised my hand. I thought I was very clever. I said, that's what Bugs Bunny calls an idiot, right? But a maroon was somebody who ran away, often enslaved Africans, and they would flee to the interior of Jamaica or Suriname, which was a Dutch colony, today an independent country. And they would form communities there, sometimes multiracial, indigenous, African, white, mixed. And often these maroons would join pirate crews. And so here we can see some of the famous pirates on your left, their years, white, black, and percentage of black for the crew. And so you can see Bellamy's at the top there, about 15%. Let's see, 40% for Davis, 96% for this gentleman, Franco, African crew, 50% for Labouche. Labouche, another guy, his nickname was the Buzzard. He was a French guy, also very sadistic, like to torture people. Lothar, another famous pirate, 39%. And then here we see Thatch, estimate 1, estimate 2, better known as Blackbeard. Thatch, better known as Blackbeard. So 60% in one estimate, 36%. But you can see that a lot of these crews, had a great deal of people of African heritage on board. Once again, some of these were self-emancipating enslaved Africans. Some of them were free blacks who had never been enslaved. And then 1/4 of the pirates broadly American from the West Indies or North America. Linked to 2 historic strongholds of piracy, the Bahama Islands and Jamaica, a few connected to smaller islands such as Barbados, Martinique, and Antigua. The North Americans were more widely dispersed, the greatest number coming from Massachusetts, mostly Boston, and a smattering from elsewhere, Rhode Island, New York, etc. So African heritage, indigenous Americans. So Black Sam Bellamy, he was known as the Prince Pirate because he didn't torture his captives, and he was apt to let people keep their boats once he had taken all the stuff off them. And so there was this one captain who he took a liking to, and he wanted to give the guy back his boat. But remember, he didn't have the power to do that. The crew voted, right? It was up to the crew. And the crew voted, nah, we're not going to let this guy keep his boat. We're going to sink the boat instead. And so, this merchant captain says to Black Sam Bellamy, you're not really a captain. You don't really have any power. This is what Black Sam Bellamy says to him. He says, damn ye! You are a sneaking puppy, and so are all those who will submit to be governed by the laws which rich men have made for their own security. For the cowardly whelps have not the courage otherwise to defend what they get by their knavery. But damn ye altogether, damn them for a pack of crafty rascals, and you who serve them for a parcel of hen-hearted numbskulls. They vilify, the scoundrels do, when they're in only the difference. They rob the poor under the cover of the law. Forsooth, and we plunder the rich under the protection of our courage, is what Black Sam Bellamy says. And he goes on to tell this merchant captain, by the way, I am as powerful as the richest prince in Europe. I am free to sail wherever I want and do whatever I want. So don't tell me I'm not a real captain. So the Widow has all of this booty on board, 50 ships worth of treasure, 53 actually, worth of treasure, gold, silks, precious stones, and they decide to come to Maine to careen their vessel. I've seen some sources say that they were headed to Richmond Island, which is pretty close to here, right? I heard some sources say they were going to Damariscotta Island or Damariscove Island. Whatever, they're headed up here to Maine to careen their boat. And the reason why you would careen your boat is what would happen is a wooden ship would get worms in it, like you can see here. And if worms give you the heebie-jeebies, don't look. That would burrow into the wood, and they would basically turn it into Swiss cheese, or there would be also marine growth on the boats. So they would have to take the boats and careen them to get this stuff off, and this is what careening looks like. They take a boat, and using pulleys and tackle, they pull it over on its side. They take off all the seaweed by burning it off. They replace any planks that have holes in it. And so they're coming up here, Maine, to careen their boats. Because as a pirate, guess what? Speed's really important for your boat. It could mean the difference between capturing prey and not capturing your prey. Or it can mean the difference between being captured by the British Navy and not being captured by the British Navy. So if you could get one extra knot of speed out of your ship, you did it. And so they were coming here to careen their vessel. But for some unknown reason, it was like a little flotilla, like 3 boats. For some unknown reason, Black Sam Bellamy diverts to Cape Cod. Some say he was going to get Goody Hallett, right? And what happens is this horrific storm comes up. It's like a 100-year storm, right? Like a wicked bad nor'easter, right? And the boat is driven up against Cape Cod and wrecks. And this is a chart that was produced by Captain Syrian Southhack. sent by the governor of Massachusetts, and he goes right through here. This is what's called Jeremy's Gutter. This is, for those of you who are Cape Codders, this is behind was the Stop and Shop, where the Friendlies is, right? So right here, and it's still swampy back there, right? But you used to be able to take a whaleboat right through this part of Cape Cod. You can't any longer. It's all connected. This is like where the Rotary is. Anyway, so South Hack, he comes from Boston. He comes through Jeremiah's Gutter, and he can see the wreck in the raging white surf following the storm, but he can't get out there. And so he marks it on the chart here, right? And this is the map that Barry Clifford will use in 1984 to help him find the wreck. And what he does is, he's got a metal detector. He can tell there's this huge mass of metal under the sand, but it's like 15 feet buried in sand. And so what he does is he takes a pipe with a 45-degree angle and puts it on his propellers, and that prop wash is directed downward, and it blows away all the sand. And so now he can get at those artifacts. Now, I was just reading a book that was published this year about shipwrecks, and naval archaeologists are not very happy with Barry Clifford because, according to them, this is not a very sound way to get at a wreck, right? He basically, like, you can imagine that there were artifacts that were blown away, right? A proper way to get at a wreck like that would go, level by level, strata by strata to get at that stuff. Well, Barry Clifford, he can't be bothered to do that. He uses the prop wash, blows that stuff away, and he starts finding these artifacts. And he thinks he's discovered the pirate ship Witta, but he can't quite authenticate it until he discovers the ship's bell. And it says right on it, Witta Galley, on the bell. And now he knows for sure he's discovered the wreck of the pirate ship Witta. 400,000 artifacts, as I said at the beginning of the lecture. Great museum. Now, I don't know, Barry Clifford, I heard him speak a couple times. Seems like a nice guy, I think that if you do this kind of work, you kind of have to have an ego about you. But I don't know about, the ethical nature of his salvaging operation versus, a nautical, archaeological operation. I'm not really here to talk about that because I don't know enough about the ethics of it. But he has pulled up some amazing artifacts. And so here he is with a small cannonball. By the way, there was an exhibit in Portland about the Witta a few years ago. Did anybody check it out? It was probably like a decade ago. All right, a couple people. So I was so stoked. I went in there. I was like, oh, my God. And I went up to the bell, and it was like, oh. And then I saw a little sign that says reproduction. But then, more recently, in the last couple of years, I went to Barry's Museum in Yarmouth on Cape Cod. I talked the kids into going with me and the wife. I promised. I said, we'll just be there for an hour and a half, I swear to God. Anyways, then I got to see the real bell. And that was really cool for me because I've been talking about this wreck for, 20 years now. And these are some of the artifacts that he's pulled up. These are cannons. And he had all these different caliber of cannons. He had French cannons were not exactly the same caliber as the British cannons, were not the same as the Dutch cannons, different size cannons. Some of them were being used as ballast. And so when I say he pulled up 400,000 artifacts, some of them are tiny little things like coins. Some of them are what's known as concretions, which is several items that have been fused together by sea life underwater over the hundreds of years that they've been on the ocean floor. So they've become calcified and sand, and they're all kind of fused together. And so what he does is he takes these concretions and he puts them in a freshwater bath with a low electric charge. And after a couple of years in those conditions, they're able to kind of pick away these concretions, the sand and calcium that's built up around these artifacts, and he gets these lovely artifacts like these cannons here. Pirate booty. Right? Real pirate booty. That's what we're talking about, right? And this is so cool. So some of this is a con jewelry from West Africa, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But these are pieces of eight. These are doubloons. This is real silver. This is real gold. And this stuff was minted in South America. Probably a lot of it was minted in Potosi, Bolivia, where the mountain of Potosi is said to have had so much silver in it that the Spanish could have built a bridge of silver from modern-day Bolivia to Spain. But a lot of the world's precious metal comes from South America and also from the Spanish colony of Mexico, Central America. And so this is a coin, and it wasn't about what the coin looked like, it was about the weight, right? The coin had to weigh a certain amount. So if it weighed too much, they would snip away part of it, and that's why you have this one that kind of looks like a heart shape. Piece of 8, by the way, is called a piece of 8 because you could cut it into 8 pieces, like a piece of pizza, right? And that's how you would make change historically, and that's why it's a piece of 8. This stuff is a con jewelry, and then this here is a gold bar, and you see the slices in that? It's because the pirates wanted to make sure that was real gold, and it wasn't just on the outside. So they sliced into it to make sure that it was gold all the way through. Once again, I think of Bugs Bunny kind of biting it like a coin to make sure it's real. And these are what's known as manillas. They just found these recently in the last 5 or 6 years. These were copper bracelets, and they were an important trade good on the west coast of Africa to buy enslaved Africans. This is one of the things that you would have used to buy enslaved Africans. So these artifacts are a testament to the Whytta's original purpose, which was, once again, a slaving vessel. This is the Sun King pistol, and you can see it's really cool on the butt of the gun here. You have this Celtic god on the butt of the pistol. And then, for pirates, their weaponry was so important. So they always had state-of-the-art, top-of-the-line, pistols, and they only got one shot with the pistol. And so they would wear many pistols around their neck. And so what you see here is the pistol and a silk ribbon. And what they would have done is they would have tied a pistol to either end of that silk ribbon and worn it around their neck. If you see pictures of Blackbeard, you'll see he's wearing several pistols in his coat sometimes. Once again, you only got one shot with these guns, right? So it was like you'd fire the gun, and then maybe you could throw it at somebody's head afterwards. But other than that, it was useless for the purposes of the fight. And so they would wear many of these pistols around their necks. And historians had read that they used silk scarves to wear them, and that was confirmed when they found this pistol on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean with the silk ribbon still attached to it. And it would have been state-of-the-art weaponry for its time. Here you can see a pistol with all of the stuff that was in it. And so the pirates would have spent a lot of time cleaning their guns, taking them apart, putting them back together, make sure they were operating correctly. But here you can see a pistol, the plate. This would have been also the gunpowder, the shot, the tampon, which was the thing that they plugged it up with. So all of this stuff within the pistol itself recovered from the wreck. That's a grenade. So very primitive grenade, right? And they would put a fuse in it. And these were really not designed to hurt people as much as modern days grenades are, but they would explode on deck and they would cause a lot of noise and smoke and add to the confusion of the attack. And then you have here, these are different types of shot. And so when you think about cannons, we think about cannonballs, but there were other things you could fire out of cannons. One of them was known as grape shot. This is basically turning your cannon into a giant shotgun, so little pellets, and that would be if you wanted to clear the deck of men. But pirates didn't use cannonballs very much because it didn't behoove them to sink their prey, right? They're trying to capture their prey. And so this is what's known as bar shot. And it was also, you see sometimes chain shot, where you have 2 small cannonballs connected by a chain. And so when this exits the cannon, it goes around like this, right? And what that does is it hits the rigging, it hits the sails, it disables the sails, and it slows the ship down. And it makes it easier to board and capture. Once again, they're not trying to sink the boat, they're just trying to disable it. So that's what that is there, bar shot. And then these are manacles. So once again, a testament to the fact that the ship was originally a slaving vessel. And this is my last slide, so thanks for bearing with me. The world's oldest Akan jewelry. So the Akan people from West Africa, modern-day Ghana. And the reason why this is the world's oldest Akan jewelry is because European colonizers melted down all the Akan jewelry that they found on the west coast of Africa, because they didn't realize what a beautiful artwork this was. These are tiny and incredibly delicate. So the stuff that they found on the Witta is the world's oldest Akan jewelry. It's a gold signet ring, which you would take and you would put on an envelope with a wax seal to seal it. And then finally, the fibula of John King, the 8-year-old boy, along with a silk stocking and a very nice shoe, because apparently he was pretty well-to-do. So that's the confirmation. And they found his skeleton underneath a bunch of cannon. So the assumption is that when the boat sank, he was crushed to death by some of the cannon, and that's where they found his leg bone. Now, I'll just finish up with a little legend here, a little lore. So Goody Hallett, some say, was on the beach that night, and she could hear the screams of the pirates as they drowned. Only 2 of the pirates made it to shore of about 120 guys. The rest of them drowned. Goody Hallett was on the beach. She could hear the screams of the men. And some say that Goody Hallett still walks the beaches of Wellfleet. Well, thanks a lot for listening to me. And if there's any questions, I'm happy to take questions at this time. I see a hand over here.
Could I ask you to...
Oh, you get the microphone here. Yeah.
So we can preserve your question.
Oh my goodness. I was very curious when I saw on one of the displays on the wall that he was coming up here to careen his boat.
Yeah.
It said specifically Cape Elizabeth.
Yeah.
And so I was always wondering, is there any record of a pirate ship business up here that, for that purpose?
Yeah, so once again, he was part of this flotilla, and one of the guys that was sailing with him was this guy, Paul Willsgrave, was originally from Rhode Island, and they didn't know that the Witta had sunk, and so his consorts actually come here to Maine looking for him, and then they realize, he doesn't show up after a while, and they hear about this wreck. But once again, I've heard varying things depending on the source, that he was headed here to Richmond Island, but I've also heard that he was headed to an island on the mid-coast. So there's nothing conclusive about that.
So there's nothing in our Cape Elizabeth history?
Not that I've ever come across,
okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, we got a question right here, Bob.
Sure can.
So you talk about them going out and chasing ships and going after Spanish ships and so forth and so on. With the lack of communication that they had at the time, how do they know where these ships were?
Just generally in the Caribbean?
Well, I'm thinking of the ones that were coming over from Spain or wherever.
Well, so there was a well-known shipping route that the Spanish vessels would have had to have taken, and they would have gone through the Strait of Florida. So they would have first started on the coast of Mexico, sometimes the coast of South America. Portobello was one of the big ports where the galleons would go to. But you might know that they built the Spanish these ships, these galleons, specifically for the purpose of moving the treasure from the quote-unquote New World to Spain. And so they would hit several ports. One of them was in Panama, where they would bring overland all of the riches from what had been the Incan Empire. So think Peru and Bolivia and modern-day Chile would all come by wagon train or by boat, and they would go to the west coast of Panama. Then they would take it overland by mule to the east coast of Panama, where it would be loaded on these galleons. Also, I believe Veracruz in Mexico was another port. And then they would hit Cuba, pick up whatever treasure was in Cuba, and from there they would sail from Spain south of Florida, north of Cuba. So it was a well-known route, and they always would go about the same time of year because they were trying to avoid the hurricanes. So they didn't know exactly where these vessels would be, but they were cruising around. Sometimes they would post themselves off a Spanish city, knowing that goods were having to come to and fro by boat. So there was a certain degree of luck involved, absolutely, yeah.
Just to follow that up, I was reading a book called The Wager, which is about a voyage that a bunch of ships that sent from England in the late 16th century to try to intercept Spanish galleons carrying the treasure.
Right.
But they mentioned that although they knew the routes that they were going to have, and they also had to look out because the Spanish Armada was scattered along the route as well, and they were frequently just as apt to run into those guys as they were the loot themselves. So there were plenty of dangers associated with that.
Yeah, which is once again why their boats needed to be so fast so that they could outrun. You know, they would have a smaller boat, a faster boat, and the shallow draft would be really important too, because if they came across a Spanish warship, one of the things they could do to evade them would be to go into shallow waters where the Spanish ships couldn't pursue them.
The other thing, unrelated, you had mentioned the people who would receive more than one share, and I know that the carpenter was one of them.
Yeah.
And I was interested in reading that book because there are so many ways that a carpenter was useful.
Yeah.
You know, when they got a hole blown in the hull, the carpenter would be down there fixing it up, or the mast broke.
Yeah.
And then I was reminded they were probably very useful when the ships had all of the holes, and they had to scrape down that, get the barnacles off, and effectively rebuild portions of the hull.
Yeah, absolutely. So they would have to take the planking out entirely and replace it with new planking. And so, and the careening too is like not something you want to be disturbed while you're doing, right? Yeah. So they would have to find a deserted place, like where they weren't going to be bothered by a warship of any nation. And so, then we think, the islands of Maine, for example. Yeah.
This has been a great presentation.
Thank you.
You mentioned that the golden age of piracy, I guess, lasted until 1725. Why did it suddenly end?
Well, a big part of what happened was that the British government had been tolerating pirates because they were making money indirectly from it. And then at a certain point in time, the merchants were just like, this is no longer tolerable. And so the British government started cracking down. And what they would do is they would offer amnesty to pirates, and sometimes pirates who accepted the amnesty would then become pirate hunters themselves. And so there are several instances of these guys who had been pirate and then became pirate hunters. And so it was just no longer useful to the British government was a big part of it. And it started to affect their bottom line about that time, 1720s or so. And so that's when they started cracking down on the pirates in the Caribbean. Yeah. There was a question up here, Bob. That was your question. All right.
You posted 3 different
Yeah.
periods that were very discreet. I was surprised by how short a period they were. So at each of those, then the British or others decided to clamp down on them?
Well, so the Buccaneers were not state sanctioned, but they weren't not state sanctioned, right? So it was that kind of thing where it was like, the British it behooved them to attack the Spanish. Even if they weren't at active war with the Spanish, they were pretty upset about the fact that the New World had been divided between the Portuguese and the Spanish, right? Which is like the Treaty of Torres from like the late 1400s, where the Pope divides the world into Spanish and Portuguese spheres of influence and excludes the French as well as the English. And so that was the Buccaneers were, they weren't state sanctioned, but the British were kind of like cheering them on in the background. And then when they get to, the point where they're in Madagascar, they are just, not as much of a hindrance to global trade as they will become during the golden age of piracy. And at that point in time, the British can no longer ignore them.
Clearly, some of these pirate voyages were extended weeks or months.
Oh, yeah.
No refrigeration, obviously. What would they be sustaining themselves on? Would they have, dried meats and fish or lard or live animals that they would, or would they be kind of harvesting along the way, trying to?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that they were always looking for, we think of pirates and we think like, oh yeah, they're just looking for gold. But they would have been looking for food, they would have been looking for rum, they would have been looking for wine. Once again, belly timber was very important to them because they were not free to eat whatever they wanted on board merchant vessels. But they would eat exactly what sailors would eat during that time. And, one of the things that I find fascinating is food, which I enjoy eating and cooking and eating other people's food, and history. And so the intersection of food and history I find of particular interest. And so the food of sailors in this period, right up until like the 1800s, is notoriously awful. They would have been eating hardtack, which were basically Biscuits that had, that were so hard that you would have to crumble them up. They often had bugs or weevils in them. Salt pork, salt cod, salt beef. If they were lucky, they would have some fresh produce, but that didn't last very long. Sometimes what they would do is they would capture sea turtles that they would put on deck on their backs, so the sea turtles would be alive. And sea turtle can actually stay alive on its back for months. And so they would have these sea turtles, and they would harvest them as necessary. They say that the fat of a sea turtle is very akin to butter. But if they could, they would have animals on deck that they could slaughter when they could. But most of it was just awful stuff that you would not want to eat today. Salted stuff, salt cod, salt beef, salt pork, biscuits, things of that nature. So, yeah, great question.
You went to Yarmouth, right?
I grew up on Cape Cod, but I went to the museum in Yarmouth.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And so that's from the
Oh, he wants you to use the microphone there.
You went to the
There you go.
I went to
Pretend
the
you're a rock
museum
star.
at Yarmouth too. And do you remember that certain pirates were captured and they explained what happened to these pirates when they were captured?
The pirates that survived the wreck? Or
Not
just in
the-
general?
No, different pirates.
Oh, yeah.
In different places. Do
Yeah.
you remember that exhibit? I think because I went with my girlfriend here. Her
Yeah.
husband couldn't make it. And
So I'm trying to remember, like, the museum itself. Once again, I kind of had to run through it because I was with my wife and kids. But, I know that what happened to these guys is,
it was interesting
Yeah.
how they metered out the punishment
okay,
to captured pirates.
remind me.
Yeah, other pirates. Yeah, I'll tell your husband on you. And the other question is that I thought privateers could really, it's a statement, it's not a question. Privateers could really take advantage of that certificate
Yeah,
because they could say, oh, I didn't know you were a French ship or
Sure.
a British ship. And
yeah. And also, it took a long time for news to get anywhere, right? So if England was at war with France and they signed a peace treaty, that information could take months to make it to the West Indies. So you always had the deniability of saying, like, oh, I didn't realize that the treaty of blah, blah, blah had been signed in, 1688 or whatever. So there was a lot of wiggle room there. But once again, these things, they went to court. And if you could prove that you didn't know that the peace treaty had been signed, or that if I didn't know it was a Dutch ship, I thought it was French, then you could get away with it. And a lot of times what would happen is these nations would protest, right? The French would say, hey, that wasn't cool. We had signed a peace treaty, and then your privateers attacked us. But if you attack somebody during peace, you're not a privateer any longer, you're a pirate. But yeah, sure, there's wiggle room in there.
And it was a pretty tough and short life
Oh, yeah.
for the average pirate.
Yeah. The other thing is, when we think about pirates, we think of these guys as loners, right? As like kind of like lone wolves. These guys were family guys. They had wives and kids that they were providing for. So this conception that we have of pirates as being, loners, these were guys who were sailors, who all of a sudden were unemployed, but they had families and wives. And there was an island, I can't remember the name of it, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean that they used as a post office so that they could send letters home to their wives. No, really, right? There was this island, and all the pirates knew about it, and if they were sailing past this island, if you were like headed back to Newport, right, you would swing by and you would grab the mail and you would take it to Newport so that wives and family members could know what their husbands who were pirates were up to. And there's a great book out there, or a couple of them, but one of them is just about pirates, and another book called Bellamy's Wife is about the wives of pirates. So really interesting stuff. So once again, these misconceptions that we have about piracy. Yeah.
There actually is still a post office on one of the Galapagos Islands.
Uh-huh.
It's a box.
Oh, cool.
And when you stop there, you pull out the packet of all the letters.
Yeah.
And if you see somebody that lives near, something addressed to someone who lives near where you're going, you take it with you and then you deliver it to
Yeah.
them.
So this would have been
So
very
we
very
sent
similar.
something to my sister-in-law that took about 5 years to get to them, but they did get it.
Yeah, better late than
So-
never, right? Yeah, wonderful. Any further questions? Oh, I see a hand in the back there.
Randall?
If they did capture seamen or crew and passengers on ships,
Yeah.
including women, what would they do with those people? Did they ransom them?
Sometimes they would ransom them. Yeah. Yep. Sometimes they would ransom them. Sometimes they would set them free after taking everything off the boat. Sometimes they would drop them off at a nearby piece of land. So all sorts of different stuff that they would do with captives. Yeah. Very often they would hold on to the captives until they had captured a boat that they didn't want, and they would put the captives on that boat and then allow them to.
Would the
sail.
captives live on the pirate ship?
They would. Yeah.
Seth, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you. Everybody, y'all have a lovely holiday, and have me back. I've got a bunch of other lectures on fascinating topics. It'd be my pleasure.